There's a specific temptation almost everyone eventually feels once they've fully recognized covert narcissistic patterns in someone's behavior, the urge to finally, dramatically expose them to their family, to mutual friends, to a room full of people, in a single satisfying moment that finally reveals what's actually been happening beneath the carefully maintained image. Today, we're tracing exactly what happens when this unmasking actually occurs, why it almost never produces the outcome you're hoping for, and what to do instead. Let's start with understanding why this urge develops so powerfully in the first place, because the impulse itself is genuinely understandable before we examine why acting on it typically backfires. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about image management and the specific exhaustion of watching someone maintain a public persona that bears little resemblance to their private behavior. After enough time witnessing this specific split, the desire to finally close the gap, to make everyone see what you've been seeing all along, becomes genuinely powerful. This isn't vindictiveness. It's often a genuine, understandable need for validation, for the accurate reality you've been living to finally be witnessed and confirmed by other people. Here's what actually happens when this unmasking gets attempted, and why it rarely produces the validation you're hoping for. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narrative control and its considerable sophistication. A covert narcissist, specifically, has typically spent years cultivating an image precisely because covert presentation depends on this image being genuinely convincing. When confronted publicly, his defensive response doesn't simply fail to produce accountability. It often actively works in his favor, precisely because the dramatic, emotional nature of public confrontation matches exactly the narrative he's already subtly cultivated about you. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about victimhood functioning as control mechanism. A public unmasking attempt hands him considerable material to work with. Your visible emotion gets read by an audience unfamiliar with the full pattern as instability rather than justified frustration. His calm, composed response, sometimes genuine confusion, sometimes performed hurt, reads to an audience without your accumulated context as the reasonable reaction of someone being unfairly attacked. Here's the specific mechanism worth understanding. Audiences without your accumulated context cannot accurately evaluate a single, isolated confrontation. Remember everything this entire series has traced about how these patterns require pattern recognition over time in order to be genuinely visible. You arrived at your own clarity through months or years of accumulated evidence, small inconsistencies noticed repeatedly, patterns tracked across countless interactions. An audience witnessing a single, dramatic confrontation has none of this context. They're evaluating one moment, stripped of everything that made that moment meaningful to you, which means the dramatic unmasking you're hoping will finally reveal the truth often reveals nothing at all beyond an emotional confrontation whose actual significance remains invisible to everyone except you. Let's trace what actually happens in the aftermath of an attempted unmasking, because understanding the specific, predictable sequence reveals why this approach so consistently produces the opposite of what you're hoping to achieve. Here's the first thing that typically happens, connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narrative reconstruction. Remember how thoroughly narcissistic psychology depends on managing perception through whatever channels remain available. Following a public confrontation, he doesn't simply need to defend himself in the moment. He gains an entire, extended aftermath period during which he can quietly, patiently reinforce exactly the narrative your confrontation inadvertently supported. That you're unstable, that you're bitter, that you've clearly lost it, in ways that concern everyone who witnessed the outburst. This aftermath narrative often proves considerably more damaging to your credibility than the original confrontation itself, precisely because it unfolds gradually, quietly, among people who now have a specific, vivid memory to anchor it to. Here's the second thing that typically happens, connecting to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the disturbing signs a narcissist wants to erase you. Public unmasking attempts often accelerate exactly this erasure process rather than preventing it. Remember what we established about how erasure intensity actually correlates with genuine significance rather than insignificance. A confrontation that genuinely threatens his carefully maintained image often triggers more urgent, more comprehensive narrative management, meaning he may work considerably harder, considerably faster, to minimize your role and discredit your account than he would have if you'd simply, quietly withdrawn without the dramatic confrontation providing this specific catalyst. Here's the third thing that typically happens. It's one worth understanding directly because it addresses the specific pain of watching this unfold mutual connections. Even ones who genuinely, privately suspect something is off about him, often become considerably more reluctant to voice this suspicion once they've witnessed a dramatic, public confrontation. So remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how covert patterns depend on plausible deniability. A calm, private conversation where you share specific, factual observations often allows someone else to reach their own conclusions gradually in their own time. A dramatic public confrontation, by contrast, often forces people into an uncomfortable position of choosing sides in a visible conflict, and many people, uncertain and uncomfortable, default toward supporting whoever appears calmer and more composed in that specific moment, which, given everything we've traced about covert presentation, is typically him. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout our conversation about why direct confrontation fails against narcissistic psychology generally. Even setting aside the audience's reaction entirely, the confrontation itself rarely produces anything resembling the acknowledgement or accountability you're hoping to witness. Remember everything this entire series has established about structural incapacity for genuine self-reflection. A dramatic public confrontation, precisely because it's dramatic and public, activates his defensive architecture more intensely than almost any other approach, making genuine acknowledgement even less available in that specific moment than it might be during a calmer, private interaction. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this entire pattern proves so consistently disappointing, connecting to something worth naming directly. The satisfaction you're imagining, the dramatic reveal, the collective realization, the vindication of finally being believed, exists primarily in your own imagination. So built from a fantasy of how the confrontation should unfold, rather than from accurate prediction of how it typically actually does. Real unmasking attempts almost never produce a room full of people suddenly seeing clearly what you've been seeing all along. They typically produce confusion, discomfort, divided loyalty, and often, painfully, increased skepticism directed at you specifically, precisely because the dramatic format itself works against the credibility you're trying to establish. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply an explanation of why unmasking backfires without addressing what genuinely matters most, what to actually do instead, and how to find the validation and accountability you're genuinely, understandably seeking through means considerably more likely to succeed. The first thing worth understanding clearly is that quiet, individual conversations with people you trust, delivered calmly and factually over time, prove considerably more effective than any single, dramatic confrontations. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine accuracy tends to reveal itself gradually rather than through single dramatic moments. If you share specific, factual observations, not accusations, not emotional characterization, simply concrete details about what actually happened, with individual people you trust, at moments when they're genuinely receptive rather than defending against a public spectacle, this information often lands considerably more effectively, allowing them to gradually integrate it alongside their own observations rather than forcing an immediate, uncomfortable choice between two competing narratives in front of an audience. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that connects directly to something we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about documentation. Remember what we've established about documentation serving your own clarity independent of anyone else's confirmation. If genuine accountability matters to you, not simply for others to witness, but for your own factual record, focus your energy on maintaining accurate, contemporaneous documentation rather than on producing a dramatic, public confrontation. This documentation serves you regardless of whether it's ever shared with anyone else, protecting your own memory and your own clarity about what actually happened, available if circumstances ever genuinely require it, without requiring the risky, unpredictable gamble of a public unmasking attempt. Here's the third thing worth understanding, it's one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms, the validation you're genuinely seeking through unmasking. Confirmation that what you experienced was real, that you weren't imagining the patterns you noticed, was never actually meant to depend on other people's public acknowledgement in the first place. Remember everything we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about rebuilding self-trust as one of the core components of genuine healing. Your own accurate perception, your own accumulated evidence, your own genuine understanding of what happened remains valid and complete regardless of whether any specific audience ever witnesses or confirms it. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about timing and patience, specifically regarding whether others eventually recognize these patterns on their own. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how covert patterns eventually, often do reveal themselves to other people, simply on their own timeline rather than through your forced intervention. People who spend genuine, sustained time around covert narcissistic behavior often eventually notice inconsistencies themselves, arriving at their own accurate conclusions without requiring your dramatic confrontation to accelerate this process. This natural unfolding, however frustratingly slow it might feel while you're waiting for it, typically proves considerably more durable and considerably more credible than anything a single forced confrontation could produce. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding. The piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. If you're currently sitting with genuine, powerful urge to finally unmask someone whose covert patterns have caused you real harm, understand that this urge deserves acknowledgement rather than shame, while also deserving the honest, practical caution we've traced throughout this entire conversation. The satisfaction you're seeking is genuinely available to you, but it typically arrives through a different, quieter path than the dramatic confrontation you might be imagining through your own accurate, complete understanding of what happened, through the specific individual conversations that gradually build genuine credibility over time, through the patient documentation that protects your own clarity regardless of external confirmation, and ultimately, through your own continued life, built entirely on your own terms, no longer requiring anyone else's public acknowledgement in order to feel genuinely, completely real. The urge to unmask him publicly comes from a genuine, understandable place. The desire for truth to finally, visibly triumph over performance. But truth in these specific circumstances typically doesn't triumph through dramatic revelation. It triumphs quietly, gradually, through your own unwavering clarity, and through the patient, individual conversations that eventually, reliably accumulate into genuine understanding among the people who matter most. That process is slower than the fantasy of public unmasking. It's also, based on everything this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations, considerably more likely to actually work. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward. What if you've already attempted a public unmasking? Before understanding everything we've traced throughout today's conversation, and now find yourself watching exactly the aftermath we described? Increased skepticism directed at you. A narrative that seems to have shifted against you rather than toward genuine understanding. This deserves honest, compassionate examination, because many people arrive at this specific piece of understanding only after already experiencing exactly the backfire we've traced throughout this entire conversation. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about self-compassion during difficult moments of retrospective realization. If you've already attempted this and watched it unfold poorly, this doesn't represent permanent, irreparable damage to your credibility, even though it likely feels that way in the immediate aftermath. Remember what we established about how genuine accuracy tends to reveal itself over time, through accumulated observation rather than single moments. People's initial reactions to a dramatic confrontation often soften considerably as time passes and as they have their own, independent experiences with the person in question. Experiences that may eventually confirm exactly what you were trying to communicate, simply on a delayed timeline you cannot control or accelerate. Here's what's worth understanding about how to actually recover credibility if you find yourself in exactly this position. Rather than attempting a second, more forceful confrontation to correct the record, which typically compounds the original damage rather than repairing it, consider instead withdrawing from the confrontational approach entirely, allowing time in your own continued, calm, consistent behavior to gradually rebuild trust that dramatic emotional display may have temporarily damaged. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how non-reactive, settled behavior over time tends to prove considerably more credible than any single, forceful defense of your own position ever could. Here's something worth understanding about a related, specific situation many people encounter. What if the covert narcissist in question is a family member? Someone you cannot simply withdraw from entirely, and the aftermath of an unmasking attempt has created genuinely difficult, ongoing family dynamics you're still navigating. This deserves specific, honest attention, because family situations often prevent the clean withdrawal available in other relationship contexts. In these circumstances, consider focusing your energy specifically on the individual relationships within the broader family system that still hold genuine potential for accurate understanding, rather than attempting to correct the entire family's collective narrative all at once. One relative who genuinely, gradually comes to understand the pattern represents more durable, more valuable progress than a dramatic attempt to convince everyone simultaneously, an attempt that often produces exactly the polarized, entrenched positions we've traced throughout today's conversation. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, one that addresses something important about the relationship between this specific caution and your own genuine right to eventually, someday, share your accurate account of what happened. Nothing we've traced throughout today's discussion suggests you should never speak honestly about your experience, never share what you observed, never seek genuine understanding from people who matter to you. The distinction worth holding clearly is between honest, calm, factual sharing, delivered individually over time without requiring immediate agreement or immediate dramatic vindication, and forced, public confrontation specifically designed to produce an immediate, collective realization that typically doesn't materialize the way you're hoping. This is ultimately the most important distinction to carry forward from this entire conversation. You're allowed to tell the truth. You're allowed to share what you experienced, honestly and completely, with people you trust. What this conversation has cautioned against isn't honesty itself, but the specific format of dramatic, public unmasking, which this entire series has traced consistently as producing effects opposite to what you're genuinely, understandably hoping to achieve. Choose the quieter path instead, the individual conversations, the patient documentation, the calm, consistent behavior that gradually, reliably builds credibility over time, and trust that this path, however less immediately satisfying than the dramatic confrontation you might have imagined, remains considerably more likely to eventually produce the genuine understanding and genuine validation you actually deeply deserve. You already know the truth of what happened. That knowing doesn't require anyone else's public confirmation in order to be complete. But if genuine understanding from others still matters to you, and it's genuinely, reasonably human for it to matter, pursue it through the quieter, more patient path this entire conversation has traced, trusting that truth, given enough time and enough genuine opportunity to reveal itself naturally, tends to find its way to the people who are actually capable of receiving it, without requiring you to risk everything on a single, dramatic moment that this entire series has shown consistently rarely delivers what it promises.